So as I mentioned, I briefly wanted to talk to you about Korea, but I didn't really want to talk a lot about their historic art because I think a lot of what is there, we've already covered enough of that by looking at Chinese and Japanese art. So you're not going to see any historic pieces in this discussion. But of course, they absorbed Chinese and Japanese influence because of their proximity in the same region. So we're just going to look at their contemporary art. And for the contemporary art, I look at the ideas of space and identity. Just like Japan, this is a country, right, with a smaller land ratio, right, to deal with. And so it leads to a different attitude towards space in general. And I also just wanted to talk again about identity and the kind of identity pieces you'd see here. So the first artist I'm going to show you is one of my favorites. It's Doho Su. And Doho Su, he started out when he had come to America for schooling. He started to really consider the difference between Asian spaces and American spaces, or Western spaces, might we say. And he talked about how he didn't understand the functionality of New York apartments. He was living in New York and he was like, I didn't understand how these spaces function. I was very much used to my home, in Korea, and I often felt very uncomfortable in these very fixed Western spaces. Remember that most Asian cultures have flexibility of space. They use fusama, or those sliding walls, right, made out of rice paper. So what he did is he made a fabric replica of his home in Seoul. You see it on the left. And basically what he would do is tack it up inside of the houses or the apartments he was living in. Because he said that the space made more sense to him. He could reconcile the space a lot better than he could living in just an American apartment. So there was this sort of fascination he started to have with spaces and the idea of the ephemerality of space, or either the fixed nature of space or the fluctuation of space. And so after he made Soul Home, he actually started to do replicas of various apartments that he lived in, like this one that was on 22nd Street. And he would replicate everything in it down to the light switches and the radiators, and he would hang them then in the galleries for his shows. And people were like, this is really intriguing stuff, these almost like ghost buildings in a sense that he was creating. So when he was first beginning his career, this is really what he became known for, these fabric pieces that replicated interior spaces. And then of course he started to kind of conceptualize them, right? Or kind of create imaginary spaces like the ones you see here at the Istanbul Biennial in 2003. He started to think about, like, what if you kind of conceptualize the space. This is a more recent piece he's done that was done for the National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Korea. And what he did was create sort of this floating replica of a temple, and then a more modernized space around it, more so actually a more colonial space, might we say, of Europeans that arrived in Korea, and what would they build. Sort of the heritage inside the modernization. So contrasting those two things together. And I think his work's brilliant. It's really about how do we internalize in our minds the spaces that we've lived in. And then the idea of comfortability in spaces, how some spaces might be more comfortable to us because of our nostalgia, right, our familiarity. And then this idea of him making these fabric homes, I always thought of him like kind of like a little snail carrying around his fabric home, on his back. You could just take it off the walls, fold it up, right, and put it in a backpack, and off he went. So I love this idea of like kind of him, like the idea that you could transport a sense of familiarity wherever you went. It would give you comfort and safety and security. Um, and they've done a lot of studies on how where you live affects your mind, your mentality, your sense of safety or your sense of orientation. So again, I think he's looking at that basic idea, but then also he starts to even think about, how do modernism and tradition clash, right? What about the fantastical? He just starts to take it further and further. He's most famous for his fabric works, but he's done so many other kinds of pieces. This is a work called Floor that I really love from 2001. And he said this one was really inspired by like life in Korea. Because he said in Korea, everything's crowded. There's a lot of people on a very small amount of land. He said Koreans don't really have any problem with you shoving them, pushing them, moving them. Like they're always jostling each other around, especially like you said on public transport or things of that nature. It's very common just to be smashed up against somebody and push past someone to get off a subway car. He said when he moved to America, he realized that people had very different standards about personal space that took him a while to get used to. Where he said even though New York is crowded, there's still this sense of how you use your personal space, touching people, what's allowed, what's not allowed. That's very different. He put it from the Asian mindset. And so this was a piece that he said he kind of came to him as he was thinking about all those thoughts and conditions, right, about the use of Asian space and Western space. He's Korean, so he does a lot of works dealing with critique of leadership, public figures in the spotlight. And I think this monument says it all without me saying much at all. It's why do we always elevate a singular person? What about the masses who are underneath keeping this whole thing afloat? Why do dictators rise? Why do they gain so much power to crush those underneath of them? So again, a lot of his work gets very political in nature because he is Korean, um, and he's South Korean, but he's well aware of what's going on in North Korea, of course. This is another really famous piece he did. It's such a beautiful work called Some/One. And what he did is take the dog tags of people who served in the military, and he made this giant piece that becomes kind of like a traditional Korean garment. Um, Everybody in Korea serves in the military in their youth. It's part of your contract with the government as being a citizen. So everybody serves in the military, hence everybody gets a dog tag. So he said, I wanted to take this idea of these multiple identities that are individual identities, but address the whole Asian mentality we have about the communal. Because he said, if you look at like Asian culture, the ones become the many, right? The macro and the micro to them is not as definitively defined to them as it would be for a Westerner. Westerners are all about individualism, right? He said Asian people aren't really like that. He said we have a sense of ourself, but we're much more steeped in the communal good. He's like, notice that in my country we all serve in the military. It's expected of you. That's not what Americans do. So he creates this gorgeous work of like many identities becoming one, and this idea of community building power and strength and trust. I think it's brilliant, brilliant, brilliant stuff, and it's been shown in many different venues, many different shows. When I went to New Orleans a couple years ago, we went to the New Orleans Museum of Art, and this is one of the beautiful sculptures out in their sculpture garden called Karma by Do Houssu, and this idea of the infinity of reincarnation, right, being visualized. I just love the piece. If you ever get a chance to go to New Orleans, they have a wonderful art museum, wonderful sculpture garden. It's just simply breathtaking. So I always recommend it to my students. The last artist I'll show you from Korea is Nikki S. Lee. I've been in love with her work since the late 90s. And I will be honest though, I like her initial work. I don't like a lot of her more contemporary work. When she started out as a student, she started to think about the idea of identity. I've told you before, I'm really interested in this. And is identity something inherent, or is it something we project? Is it something we can create? And I've always felt very strongly that life is a costume pageant. Life's a costume party. You decide what to put on as your outfit, right? You decide who you want to be with a lot of the trappings that you affix to your body. It communicates things to other people. So what she started to do, she's like, basically didn't have a lot of money. She decided to start taking on identities or infiltrating groups based on those identities. So on the left, she's hanging out with a bunch of swing dancers. They're not swingers like swapping partners for sex, so sorry not to be too exciting there, but swing dancers. And then she also, took on the identity of a senior citizen. And so what she does in these projects is she tries to infiltrate various communities to see if she can exist within them, living their life, following their code, speaking their language in a sense. What does it take to gain admittance to these groups, these communities, right? Works like the Skater Project, a lot of people were like, well, that's intriguing. But then she started to actually play around with like, what if you're infiltrating ethnic groups, right? Racial groups. Like, well, then what happens then? This stuff then starts to get really edgy. This is where I started to get very excited with the work because I was like, it's kind of cultural appropriation, But what she's trying to communicate is if she wears the trappings, right? If she puts on the same lipstick, right? If she wears her hair the same way, right? If she interacts with people in the same way, will she be considered valid within that community? And she found a lot of the times, yes, she would be. She would go unnoticed completely and totally. Um, and I was like, God, this is just so damn fascinating. If you dress like a schoolgirl and you act like a schoolgirl, are you a schoolgirl, right? Um, so again, I think it's really monumental what she decided to do, thinking about identity. It's even more interesting when you think about the fact that she's Korean and some of the groups she's infiltrating, right? She's not of their background, so and managing to make herself a part of them. And you'll notice that all the pictures are like time stamped. It's just somebody taking photographs of her. She always tells the groups when she's done what she was doing, and she says she's been met with all types of reactions. She's been met with just pure outrage, down to, oh wow, that was interesting what you did, or I don't mind at all. So she says it's very intriguing. She says she notices the most blowback when she tries to infiltrate, like, African Americans or Hispanics, or she tries to do something like that. She says definitely she gets a lot more pushback. But she never lets on what she's doing. She never says, I'm trying to fool you in a sense. And again, she gets various reactions to that. She moved away from that work in the mid 2000s, and now she's doing a couple different projects. But one of the ones she's been working on is the Parts series, where you see her interacting with somebody, but you don't get to see the other person. You only see part of them. So the idea of like what's cut off in the narrative, like what are we not seeing, is the question she's asking with these works. I don't think they're quite as strong as her identity works, but I think she does have an interesting way of approaching art making. And notice that the art making she's doing, I mean, I guess we could classify it as photography, but it's really not. It's more performance work, it's more conceptual work, it's more idea based work. So it's all about the ideas that she's having and letting those ideas kind of guide her work.